Hello and welcome back, and that's right, we're returning to the subject of DIY NAS motherboards with this absolute banger. This is from CWWK, a brand that we've spoken about multiple times before, and this is an MITX motherboard rocking out with the N150 Intel processor, another thing I've said on the channel before. But you know, one of the things I've never ever mentioned on the channel before? An N150 powered CPU NAS motherboard with two 10GB NICs, both of which aren't coupled down to Gen 3x1. These have got Gen 3x4 bandwidth to play with between them, with Intel X550 controller management inside. So what we're looking at here is kind of the first of its kind. I've seen loads of N15 powered NAS devices, and I've seen N15 powered NAS devices with one 10GB NIC, but this manages to get the job done with two, and supports 6 SATA, and supports 3 M.2, and has SODIMM memory. This thing should not exist. Let me catch up the people in the cheap seats, but the Intel N150 is a twin lake processor from the brand that promotes low power consumption but high capability. It's quad core, it's got integrated graphics. Alongside that, it arrives with a very low TDP, sub 10 watt, in some cases between 6 and 8 watts, just for the CPU on its own, not the rest of the infrastructure. But the thing that's always been the crippling, crushing factor has been lanes. These are the things that span out from the CPU to get the job done. All of the components and the accessories that we add to our systems, they need lanes, they need speed, and their processor has 9 lanes to play with. That's why, although there are plenty of DIY NAS motherboards in the market, like this one, also from CWWK, that's got two 10GB NICs, they generally arrive with far more powerful processors on board and a price tag to match. This arrives at 295 or 298 at the time of recording, and even though it's a 9-lane processor, they have done absolute miracles spreading out that alignment of PCIe bandwidth throughout the system. Now, one thing that is missing, I will say, is a PCIe slot. Lots of users always generally have to toss up between M.2 slots and a PCIe, and in some cases they're shared, but that isn't the case here. Me personally, what was I ever going to use that PCIe slot other than adding improved network ports? And given this has 2x10GB and it has 3 M.2s inside, I'm never going to miss the PCIe slot. Let's drill down into the individual components, what's included under the bonnet here. Now, interestingly, the 6x SATA, as you can see there at the top, is not 6 standard SATA connections. It's actually 2 standard SATA connectors, so you're going to need your SATA cabling, but then it's an 8643 SAS expander port there, that HD mini SAS I should say, going into 4 clipped SATA. Again, you can get the cable, you can buy it separately, they're very, very cheap, but that ultimately means that you can add the 6 SATA connectors. In my testing, and I'll go through that later, I attached 6 SATA drives, largely because I wanted to get the kind of base level power consumption, another thing I will touch on later. Now, it's the ASM1166 controller, which I know isn't for everyone, but it is on a Gen 3x2 lane there. So again, 20GB of internal bandwidth to play with. I just can't see 6, even SATA SSDs fully saturating that SATA controller there. Now, moving over to the rest of the storage, we've got the 3 M.2 slots. Now, I say 3, there's actually technically 4, because you've got one there for your M key, right there based at the middle there, so a Wi-Fi card. There's also SATA adapters that you can use. I wouldn't really recommend it in this build, largely because, as you can make out, we have got that M.2 placed underneath the other one. So you're going to need a ribbon cable and an adapter fanning out. You can get them. I think IOCrest and CWWK have got one, but that's something to keep in mind there. But for the 3 that remain, they are all Gen 3x1 speed there. So you're looking at, realistically, in excess of about 8 to maybe capping at maximum 900 megabytes per second. For each one of those. I will highlight though that when I did have drives inside here, if I attach a heatsink, which is what I did, which I didn't really need to do at that speed, I will say the proximity with this fan is pretty bloody close there. Now, more compact, low-level heatsinks, you should be fine if you're going to use them. And indeed, if you get this device with the other heatsink option, because there is a small ball bearing version you can get in the standard class model. That one doesn't interfere with the M.2s whatsoever, but if you go for the more aggressive, egregious fan to keep things cool, just keep in mind they're in pretty close proximity to those M.2s. And the 10 gig NICs, again, as mentioned, have got the X550 controller there, and that is on a Gen 3x4 lane. So again, plenty of bandwidth for those 10 gig NICs. And indeed, the 10 gig NICs there, alongside those, not only have we got an HDMI out, which is always handy depending on your NAS OS of choice, but you've also got additional USB 3.2 ports. You've got a USB 2 port inside for your OS drive, which is what I used for Unraid later in the video. But alongside that, an SD card slot as well for, you know, a recovery drive, a bootloader drive and more, even Type-C. This is a very well put together board. Alongside that, a SODIMM slot. Now, I should not, I repeat, I should not have to, in 2026, sorry about my phone, I should not be praising a device for having a SODIMM slot. When you buy it, it doesn't even include the memory. But the reason I'm praising it is because we're starting to see, with the shortages in certain components, SSDs, hard drives and RAM, that some boards are starting to roll out with pre-attached memory, LPDDR4 or LPDDR5, which, although is good to include ultimately more affordable memory compared to market off-the-shelf RAM buying, there's a lot of users that don't want that maximum RAM or don't want that specific kind of RAM. So having a SODIMM slot gives you that element of flexibility or to reuse RAM that you have. Now it is DDR5, but it's not ECC, but at this price point and at that processor level, if you expected ECC, you were expecting it to rain bacon tomorrow. Now let's talk about this device going through the testing, because it was mostly plain sailing with one weird little exception. We'll talk about power consumption. Now I had the device in 3 different profiles. Now for a change, I normally start with the lowest and smallest profile, but we're going to go to the biggest and work backwards for reasons that will become clear in a moment. Now, the test I ran was with 3 M.2s and 6 SATA drives. The 3 M.2s in a RAID 0, the 6 SATA in a RAID 0. I had the CPU around 25% utilization. I had 2 10 gig network ports active, and I had 32 gigs of DDR5 memory in the slot. Once you funneled that through with that CPU, and hopefully on the Unraid screen you saw the power consumption of just the PSU, the total of all of that running with the SATA SSDs was around 50.5 to 50.6 watts utilization. Now, I could have used bigger, more aggressive hard drives, but that would have added around 5 to 8 watts per drive. And given that everyone's got different kinds of drives they use, I just thought I would use SATA SSDs because they barely use a watt each, and therefore it becomes them a lot easier to track. Obviously they're being activated a little bit more power, but ultimately it was to give you a baseline which you can then add 5 to 8 to maybe 10 watts depending on bigger, larger hard drives later. Next, I had that system running in idle state. So you had still had all of the drives in there, but I dismounted them from within Unraid, so they weren't actively mounted within Unraid. The CPU was as close to 0 as I could get it, but it still had the 2 10 gig NICs idle and just lightly pinging when they needed to, alongside 32 gigs of RAM. Now, in that idle comparative state, we saw a power consumption of around 42.6 watts, so a drop of around 8 to, let's be generous and call it 9 watts between the two of them, which kind of makes sense once you factor in the 10GbE and you factor in SATA SSDs rather than more aggressive hard drives in terms of power drop. But where things got confusing, and I'm still investigating, is when I had the system in not just close to idle, but also with none of that SATA, with less of the 10GbE. So I had the system set up with one M.2. That one M.2 was doing very light ping, little bit of read. Alongside that, I only had one 10 gig NIC that was nowhere near saturation point. And alongside that, I had the same 32 gig of RAM inside. Now, as you might have seen there flick on screen, the CPU was utilising around 5 watts, according to Unraid. And ultimately, I expected this to sit maybe at around 10 to 15 watts. But because of the 10 gig NIC being a bit of a ramp up compared to some of the others, it was higher than I anticipated, and I saw numbers of around 28 to 30 watts. Now, I need to check if that is my PSU. I need to check if it is the 10 gig NICs. I need to check just what the hell was going on, because that was definitely higher than I expected it to be. It still doesn't undercut a lot of the things I'm saying, because this board is frankly a frigging marvel. But still nonetheless, The idle power consumption was higher than I would have liked to have seen. Still being investigated though. However, for all of my positive hyperbole, we've got to talk about performance, because those of you that have ever used a N150 CPU NAS system will know that you've got to set your expectations a little bit more realistic. This is an efficient CPU. Sure, it runs from 0.8 gigahertz and can be clocked up to 3.6 gigahertz, which is pretty darn good. But that still doesn't mean with only 9 lanes of Gen 3 to play with, that you're going to be, shooting for the sun. Again, there's a reason boards like this one cost more. Now, in terms of the individual internal performance, I went in via SSH and command line and tested the M.2s. The M.2s gave me 820 megabytes per second read over 765 megabytes per second write. Now again, that was the internal SSDs one by one tested. They're all pretty much the same with a repeated 1 gigabyte read or write test. Now, for the SATA SSDs, I tested one of them internally and got 464 over 462 read write, and again repeated 1 gigabyte file testing there, so all fairly respectable stuff. Now, testing the 10 gig performance, I had to get a little creative. I had the board mounted on the Ugly Betty that we've used from previous videos, and then from there I had the system connected to a 10 gig UniFi switch, and then from there I had a Windows system connected with a USB 4 to 10 gig adapter, the UniFi model there, and on the Mac side of things I used the QNAP USB 4 to dual 10 gig adapter there. Now I did that because I wanted the Mac to be connected to the M.2s that were in RAID 0, and I wanted the Windows system to be connected to the SATA SSDs. Now, throughout the course of that, the numbers were pretty darn good. Obviously, we had to take into account that the network saturation between each of these individual ports was leveraging back and forth, so sometimes we saw pretty wild numbers, but ultimately, I was able to get, on average, around 800 to 900 megabytes per second up and down externally from both of those ports. And often, when it was the Mac kind of leveraging the M.2 NVMe speeds, it got a little bit more. But just keep in mind that the SATA drives were on a Gen 3 times 2 lane there, which allowed it to have 20 gigabits there. So it was never really going to be able to go higher than around 1.5 to 1.6 gigabytes per second. And in the case of the M.2s, even though you RAID them together and can get a bit of performance, more in terms of read than write, it's worth highlighting again, they are all on Gen 3 times 1 each, which means individually they could only really get between 800 to 900, and when you RAID them together, you're only getting very small incremental benefits there. Ultimately, it's worth remembering with this board that although it is a dual 10 gig NIC system, each of the individual SATA types, individual storage types that are inside present their own slight bottleneck because of their overall CPU. So those of you looking at these two ports hoping you're going to get flat out 20 gigabits per second or 2 gigabytes per second consistently all the time need to think about the overhead of those drives running through this. I don't think I've been particularly secretive. I chuffing love this board. I love this exists. I love the ingenuity. I love that this will hopefully become, for those that want pre-made solutions, bigger, better and more aggressive and more exciting N150 powered NAS systems. I want to see this with that i3 version, the N355. The fact that they've managed to eat this much out of a 9-lane processor, chef's kiss. Now, is it cheap? No. Very few things are these days, and you can still pick up the single 10 gig version of this for around $200 to $220 if you shop around. But a $295 give or take for this directly from their website, and also starting to appear on sites like Amazon and AliExpress. This is a no-brainer for me that are those looking at those more power efficient systems but want to scale out tremendously in terms of storage and in terms of network connectivity. But keep your feet on the ground, and I will be investigating that power consumption of the idle state, and if I get an update before this video goes out, I'll pin it to the comments below and stick it in the written review, which should hopefully be ready at the same time as this. But thank you so much for watching. If you want to get hold of this for yourself, please do me a solid and use the links in the description. Doing so results in a small commission coming to me and Eddie here at NAS Compares. It's literally just us doing this. But don't do it unless 1, you found a video helpful, 2, you were going to buy it anyway, and 3, you were going to buy it from those shops. If those 3 things are true, support creators on YouTube. It really helps us out and it costs you nothing extra. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.